Welcome to today's Signatory forum session. We're really excited to be talking about this kind of emerging area of practice of digital workplace wellbeing and inclusion. Over the last 3-4 years, we've had a complete change of landscape of what most of our lives look like in terms of the lines between our work and our home lives, the interaction between work and our families, and we're really looking today to explore that concept. And I'm so pleased that we've got Alessandra from Live More Offline to kind of introduce us to this concept and take us through some of the data and some of the kind of good practice that you can implement in your organisation. Alessandra, please introduce yourself.
Hi, so it's a real pleasure to be here with you today. I'm Alessandra La Via and I'm the founder of an organisation called Live More Offline. I got into digital wellbeing after experiencing firsthand the impact of always-on cultures in my former life as a corporate accountant, initially within Big Four and then working within large multinational organisations, so perhaps similar to a number of your signatories here as well. And then basically I became curious about how digital habits, how my behaviours with back then the BlackBerry phone it's from a whole other world, how those behaviours were impacting my well-being and how they were impacting well-being across society in general. And I started to do a master's degree with the University of Aberdeen, looking at the research behind the impact of technology on well-being. Started talking about this before the pandemic, and then the pandemic happened, and suddenly the impact of the ways in which we're working digitally became headline news, became at the front and centre of our people strategies, and also issues around inclusion. And over the last 5 years, Live More Offline has been working with organisations around trainer and dating, and data and training around digital wellbeing. Yeah,
I mean, you were certainly ahead of the curve, not being able to anticipate how relevant all of that understanding was going to become in our society. I mean, it's exactly the hot area at the right time. So can we begin with you sort of telling us a little bit more about digital workplace wellbeing? What does that mean? What does that look like? And just kind of frame it a little bit for us.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'd be delighted to. I've got a few slides that I can share on this to just give you a little bit of an introduction into what it is that we're talking about, because this is a brand new area that many of us are having to consider. And over the last few years, a number of us may have been experiencing video call exhaustion more and more. We've been hearing more about the impact of distractions during remote work, and actually how that can make the difference between whether our remote work teams are productive or not, the how of how we work. We've also had data that shows that our working days have lengthened and people are facing greater pressures to be connected outside of work. And we've also got a growing concern around loneliness and engagement within remote teams, and questions around how this impacts different people differently. Is this felt more by the younger generations, for instance, or those who are single? And all of this then also has inclusion at its heart, and we'll be talking more about some of the inclusion aspects of this. But it's absolutely vital that we start to think about these human impacts of the ways in which we're working digitally, because of the fact that hybrid work is now here to stay. Mm-hmm. When we look ahead into the future, we see that we're trending now, we're settling on around about 30% of our time working from home. You'll typically hear organisations talking about 2 or 3 days in the office. So that means that we've gone from what was a short, sharp move into digital work to now needing that digital work to be set up in a way that ensures that everybody within an organisation can thrive. So this is absolutely vital as well when we're looking in the context of the fact that many people are struggling at the moment with retention and attraction of talent. We've got a shortage of talent within the tech sector in particular. And so this can be a real key enabler for retaining and attracting people to our organisations. And from an inclusion perspective, actually the data shows that we've never had a greater variety of experiences within digital work. Shortly after the pandemic, Microsoft surveyed people to see how they were coping with remote work. And they found that leaders were much more likely to say that they were thriving rather than struggling or surviving than other people within their organizations. And I think that this data is absolutely fascinating when you think then about the fact that it's often leaders within organizations that are having to make the decisions on behalf of their people about how we work. Yet we naturally look through the lens of our own experience, and it can be really hard to understand how digital work can actually be impacting other people. And that's really what we kind of help with. Data kind of broadly within society shows that some of our greatest challenges are things like not being able to unplug, from the always on working day, challenges around collaboration and communication, and loneliness. And these are again going to those human impacts of digital work. So when it comes to organizations, then it's really key first to understand that your digital behaviors, your digital beliefs, the way in which you organize in digital work can have an impact across well-being, whether people are feeling burnt out, whether they are struggling to disconnect, whether they're overloaded by video calls. There can be an impact on performance. Have you got a focus of distraction rather than a culture of distraction rather than a culture of focus? And also we've got the challenges around engagement and retention and inclusion. And we'll talk a lot more about the inclusion aspect of this, but certainly what we see is that within hybrid work, our digital ways of working can either be an enabler or a barrier to inclusion, depending on how we construct our ways of working. And actually, if done well, remote working is often more favoured by women, by typically underrepresented demographics. But do we have a culture where we end up with out of sight, out of mind, or where those people who are working more digitally end up being disadvantaged? So these are the three pillars that we look at within Live More Offline: digital balance, digital productivity, and virtual connection. And what we're really all about is helping organizations to harness the power of data and understand how their people are in reality experiencing in digital work. And just a couple of examples of the things that we do. We've looked into things like the average amount of time that people lose to ineffective meetings, and found that actually on average we lose 80 minutes per week to ineffective meetings. And the cost of this can really add up within organizations, particularly when you see that it's often more senior people that end up with more meetings within their diaries as well. And we run a digital culture diagnostic report within organizations, so we help workplaces to really look at their culture and understand how their people are experiencing it. And this is just one example of the type of information that we feed back. So we look at how many people are feeling that pressure to be connected outside work that then drives that burnout. And then we look further, so we skew this, how is it experienced by gender, by age, for instance, and then asking the question of, well, what impact does this have? Why does it matter if someone is, feels a pressure to be connected outside work? Well, we're looking at then actually, based on the data from your people, how more likely are they to be burnt out or to, desire to leave? And then we can reflect back also where that pressure is coming from, so that you can then be able to take targeted measures to help the people that are struggling the most with these issues and be able to get to those root causes. So that's just one small example of the types of things that we do. And hopefully that'll give a little bit of background in setting the scene.
Thank you for framing that, Alex. I think, naturally you can start to see that dotted line of where this could play a part in our diversity and inclusion practice. Yeah. So if you're HR or a D&I manager, why should you be concerned about this? What should we be pulling out in terms of how that plays out in our D&I practices?
Yeah, so I think it is absolutely vital to include this within your D&I practices. Firstly, by starting to look at, well, how are people working within your organization? Do you have a situation where you've got a greater proportion of underrepresented demographics working from home? And then what do you have in place that's ensuring that they are being, they have an equity of experience, that they have an equity of progression as well? And even simple things like, for instance, our video call practices, are they inclusive too? Much of our work has moved into new formats, into new forums. So it's important that we step back and take a look at this new future of hybrid work. Then how is that impacting inclusion and impacting well-being?
And so in terms of collecting that data and understanding your people, obviously that's well-trodden path for lots of areas of inclusion work. When we talk about that, what should we, is just knowing that we have, this hybrid model enough? Where should we be drilling in on that detail?
Yeah, so I think absolutely. So gathering that data, I think what you really need to be doing is pairing up both the kind of quantitative data and the qualitative data. So you need to be ensuring that you are actually capturing people's voices from a diverse range. And I think it's important to look across each one of those three areas in particular. So asking people about their experiences and drilling into, are people feeling more burnt out? How are people actually experiencing video calls, for instance? Are they a sucker of time? Are they leaving people exhausted? Do we even know? And also then looking at how that skews by demographic. Because when it comes to, for instance, neurodivergence, then it is actually more draining and it can be less inclusive if we have a really heavy meeting focused culture that can impact different people in different ways. So, we help organizations. You can run a digital culture diagnostic with our organization, and that will provide these insights. That's one way in which you can gain that. But also it's starting to have these conversations as well within your teams. It can be as simple as your next staff meeting, picking one aspect of this out and starting to ask the questions. So like, hey guys, actually, how are we doing here with video calls? Like, how many of them are unnecessary? How many of them are too long? How can we bring more structure? One of the things that I do is helping people to bring work outside of meetings altogether as well. So I would say it's starting to understand where are your people's greatest pain points, and then narrowing in on those and starting to gather that data, gather that evidence.
And I've seen some great practice in terms of almost they're a very simple weekly check-in through a survey, and we're talking the most basic of survey, built yourself, that type of thing, asking were you able to enjoy things outside of work this week? Did you feel that you had fair support of your manager? It's an anonymized, so that all of the data that comes in, so it's a check of more than one thing. It's that check of that, did you have the balance in your week, but also making sure that that work is being attributed fairly. And so when we think about opportunity and where digital exclusion can happen, especially for underrepresented group, it's making sure that the work allocation and the opportunity to show your potential and your skill is fairly placed. It's asking those and understanding those responses as well. So I think it can be very simple, and as you say, that can be a discussion in a meeting, but it's starting to understand, we've fallen into some behaviours. Are they the right ones? Are they the behaviours we'd have chosen if we'd actually done this as a planned exercise, rather than this organic progression that we've all had to kind of entertain? And I think that's having some of those questions posed as well. One of the things that got quite a lot of press was meeting time. giving the charge out rate for each person, so you could in real time to see how much that meeting cost the organisation. It obviously got quite a lot of heat as a concept, and I'd be interested to hear your view on this, because there's this balance defined, isn't there, about efficiency, but when we think about isolation, actually having some of these ineffective moments are the moments where people actually feel their connection. So I'd be really interested to kind of hear your opinion on how do we balance that, how do we play that out so that we're including, we're being effective, it feels like there's a balance.
Yeah, oh, it's such a great question, and it's so relevant, and there is so much to say on this. And I guess so firstly, we've got the challenge of too much meeting time, which is what we're talking about with that calculator. And then we've also got the challenge of people feeling disconnected. So actually, when you look at that too much meeting time, how are we using those meetings? So if we're using those meetings in a way where actually some of that work could have been brought ahead, or kind of done in an asynchronous fashion, or is it just, are we using a meeting as like a general project status update, which isn't actually connecting people at all? Then yeah, we're losing that valuable real estate for human connection, and that's really what meetings should be about, is connection, discussion, and collaboration. So the first step would be taking your work processes and dividing them into the kinds of things that sit well in meetings and the kinds of things that don't sit so well in meetings. Take the things that don't sit so well in meetings, and then actually just reinvent the way in which you work. Start to use things like shared documents more, having status update trackers, for instance, like Asana or Trello boards, things like that. And then you lose a lot of that unnecessary meeting time. Then re-engineer your meetings to enhance connection. And there are lots of things that you can do here. One thing that I quite like to do, because different people experience loneliness differently, and you'll have some people that genuinely are wanting more time to connect, and there will be some people that say that actually they're spending too much time on calls altogether. If that's a situation that your organization is in as well, isn't, you can do things like enabling the meeting to start 10 minutes before the official meeting start time, and then having that as optional connection time for the team. So anyone who wants to have a bit of a chit chat completely unrelated to work can have that little bit of time, and they know that that's going to be available directly before the meeting. But that's just one example of how you can re-engineer your meetings around human connection. But I think that's the key. Reduce the volume and go for quality over quantity.
And I think it speaks to the boundary piece, doesn't it? Because if you're going to do that 10-minute thing, which I love, and actually we do that here sometimes, don't start the meeting 10 minutes early. This is a separate piece of agenda item. This is the connection chat. How are you doing? What did you get up to at the weekend? This isn't, okay, we're going to have a pre-meeting. And then whoever joins actually at the meeting time feels that they're on the back foot, because you've then created a different expectation, and that time then becomes something else, and it's another way of creating a kind of a clique that people then feel as a stressor, because especially when we think about our neurodivergent colleagues, the expectation, and then you're moving that expectation and of what was meant to happen in that time. When did I feel comfortable joining? Actually, what's then really happening? So I think, and there's lots of, as we continue to talk, I think a lot of this comes back to having shared boundaries about expectation, and making sure that where we set those boundaries, we stick to them. You don't have to be in the C-suite to be a leader in showing, how a boundary should be applied and maintaining that. And I think if we can all do a little bit of that, it helps us all move this piece forward, without us just creating new little pockets of confusion and uncertainty. So I think that's, it's some of these new concepts, you've got to play them out, but almost keep be strict about them, rather than just, oh, we'll do this and it'll be kind of cute and it will just naturally work. It does need a bit of work to make them successful.
Clear boundaries and the why as well. So explaining why we're doing this.
Yeah. I think we've got to remember, when we're engaging the majority, they may not be feeling the way that the issue we're trying to address is kind of feeling, and so that why is not going to be necessarily evident. And so I guess I would like to also dig into, we've identified a few areas of negative and counterproductive sort of practices and behaviours that come off the back of 3 years of very up and down work practice and environment. So from your point of view, what does poor digital inclusion look like?
Yeah, so I think poor digital inclusion essentially looks like not starting by understanding or even asking the question about how our digital behaviours and our digital beliefs impact others. It starts with that presumption that actually there isn't that big difference, or that it's too difficult to be able to understand. And I think that it also comes from that lack of explicit expectations as well, where then you end up in a situation where different teams and different groups of people are ending up kind of self-creating their own company culture, and you end up with a fragmented company culture where different people are behaving or working together in different ways. And I guess one example of that, for instance, could be the communications channels that we use, and you end up with one team heavily using Slack, another team heavily using another, and before you know it, we've kind of co-created a really fragmented and confusing kind of way of working, where you're not quite sure where information is held and what channel to use to connect with others. So I think intentionality is absolutely key, and starting with the data.
I think also when we're thinking about this, and of course we are from a business point of view, is risk. When we start to allow this fragmented culture to build. So as you say, are some using Slack? Are some using WhatsApp? Are some actually going outside what we would have used as our company tools to connect in this way and share information, because they don't feel equipped or feel that that's going to be the best way for them to share or communicate. So I think this is not just important because we want our people to feel good and have that balance, but also to protect business and individuals from not steering themselves into hot water by going outside what would have been traditional company practice. And I think that's so important when we're considering the amount of devices that we have available to us, between personal and business devices, and those lines start to blur as well. So I think that there's a few angles for us to keep our people safe in. I know that you mentioned in some of the stats that you shared at the start of the session, this is impacting people differently. And I think age here is a really interesting perspective to play. And I know from other research that we've seen that some of the feelings that people have in terms of wanting to have good intergenerational working practices, and one of the biggest challenges here is digital inclusion and feeling that there's this shared language. So I'd love to explore how this impacts some of different groups differently.
Well, I think that's incredibly true, and age is a key factor. Digital well-being is very generational. When we look at the data, what we see is, for instance, that pressure to be connected outside of hours, that number one challenge of remote workers. It is felt much more significantly by people who are younger within the workforce. People who are younger, they also tend to feel like they have to be responding to messages more quickly, and this all really has an impact. And it's quite interesting. I was delivering a training session for an early careers group a couple of months back for a large organisation. And in the morning session, this group who had been with the organisation for a couple of months, a number of them had their laptops out and they were wanting to stay connected and be able to reply to messages. And at the end of it, we kind of checked in and with them, tried to understand what had happened, what their experience was. And then also the sponsor of the kind of training actually kind of took a step back and thought, actually, do you know, this is really interesting. These guys, they've only been with the company for 2 months. There is nothing here where, nothing's going to fall apart if you're away for a training session for just a couple of hours. Yet they were feeling such a pressure to be seen, to be replying, to be online, that they couldn't step away for just 2 hours for this training session. And I think that what it really points to is the fact that a lot of people who've onboarded remotely onboarded in this situation where you're not surrounded by your colleagues, you're not just picking up the cues from others about kind of what the expected culture is, but instead you are trying to intuit and you come up with your own perception of what that culture is and what the expectations are of you. And in a remote culture where you start to see a few people sending messages, kind of later or replying quickly, you quite often put a greater pressure on yourself than your leaders would put on you. So I've really seen this both from research, but also from working with organizations, that younger age group are feeling some of these pressures and they're looking a lot more for guidance and, to be able to help them to manage and to understand what an organization actually expects of them. And if we don't get this right, then what happens is a number of things. Firstly, we're not setting up our young people with the skills and abilities to be able to work effectively. If you're in the tech sector, you might be doing things like coding. That requires significant deep focus. And if you're worried about kind of having to reply to messages quickly, then what I see coming out of the surveys that I run is often exactly this. I find it really hard to do my work because I feel a pressure to be monitoring Slack. So that's one aspect from an age perspective, but certainly also it is the loneliness and the belonging side as well. And I think and also learning, kind of being mentored. These things are much easier in person. And so that's where it's really important to be intentional about how we're onboarding people, how we're using our days in the office. If we've got a hybrid work situation, are we using those days in the office in a really intentional way? But yeah, so that's the age side.
I think it's so interesting that we've got that kind of presenteeism that many of us may have felt in our early career, that it was so important to be seen to be very active, and that's translated to people earlier in their careers feeling that they need to be so very connected, and how quickly I respond to message, it will be how I'm seen as my performance is measured, rather than the quality of that output. It's the speed of which I'm and the hours that I'm seen. It's really interesting that that's a behavior that's translated, because we've all seen that throughout our different stages of our career, people that have been working many hours, but is the output quite the right level, and that's one of the things I have been very interested to see. The other sort of side of this is we see that the wonderful opportunities that being able to work in a hybrid way offers people with caring responsibilities.
Yeah.
But are we actually seeing that this is just becoming another disadvantaging factor because the way that you can split hours and keep track of hours becomes slightly more murky, and actually the expectation and the opportunities are being diluted? Are you seeing that in the data at all?
I think what I'm seeing is that it's how it's complicated. And I think hybrid working, when done well, can be such an enabler for inclusion. Suddenly, people who have caring responsibilities, maybe kind of, mothers returning to work, people with disabilities, even actually from a kind of ethnic minority perspective, some of that kind of out-group feeling can be very much reduced in the digital working environment too. So it can be a real enabler for inclusion. But at the same time, if we have people working flexibly, that maybe some earlier in the morning, some later at night, that contributes to that blurring of boundaries. And without the intentional guidance, without the kind of communication, without leaders modeling healthy behaviours, what that can translate to is then a pressure for people to be connected at the hours that anyone is connected, and then we're all connected for greater numbers of hours than we actually need to be. So there has to be it comes down to trust, and it comes down to an education about the value of that disconnected time, and why as individuals we need to care for it, and why as managers we need to champion it too. So yeah, that's what I'm seeing.
My goodness, I want to kind of clap along to that, because I think that so much we're realizing more and more trust is what we're really playing with in organizations on both sides, and where that starts to erode, then that's when we see our biggest challenges emerging. And when we think about presenteeism, that's all around trust, isn't it? It's feeling that unless I'm seen to be active, then I'm not going to be valued. And I think that that's something that in the wider D&I space people are exploring, and why, and especially then we start to really consider why are some groups trusted less than others. And we really have to sort of come back to our unconscious bias and really consider what is making us feel these ways, and why we are not able to provide similar sort of expectations across our whole organization, rather than perhaps our early career journey that looks quite different, and we're not going to give them that opportunity or tool to use because there isn't the trust there. But that's fine for this group of people. I think there's some challenging conversations to have to understand why the level of trust in your organization looks like this, and where's the gap, a bit of a gap analysis. So I'd love to hear a couple of what you'd kind of round up as your no-nos that you'd kind of advise against in terms of when we look at this what poor digital inclusion looks like.
Yeah, so I think actually I might circle to trust in the no-nos. So actually one of the no-nos would be measuring people's performance based on whether their light is green on Teams.
Oh,
a fascinating one, isn't it, from a trust perspective?
And well, it's just, I think as a metric of anything, it's not showing you anything. If anything, it's drawing you to this micromanagement. And I don't think anyone enjoys micromanaging someone or being micromanaged. And that green light on Teams piece, every time I hear someone speak about that, my mind immediately goes to there'll be microaggressions that go alongside that kind of monitoring, whether you are aware of them or you are not. But that kind of level of monitoring, there will be other problems that you're seeing across your activity. So yeah, you've hit on my absolute bugbear.
And I love that that's a real bugbear for you too, because it is absolutely key. If you have that challenge, it suddenly means that people struggle to be able to do things like taking a normal phone call away from their screen for fear of the fact that they might be judged to not be working. And again, if we're in a situation where we've got a greater proportion of underrepresented demographics working digitally, then those digital pressures and even kind of digital kind of unconscious biases or discriminations, they will impact the people who are typically underrepresented more than others. And so it's absolutely vital, even more so in a hybrid context, that we are educating on some of these fallacies and these myths of the ways in which we interact digitally. One thing I love doing is actually showing kind of going through some of the beliefs that we have, and then there's a video online of someone who attached their mouse to a fan that just moved the mouse, and it's like, actually you don't know, just because someone's light is going on Teams, it's got no actual bearing to the quality of their work or what they're doing.
I think when we flip that to the other side as well, we do have a responsibility to make sure that people are safe in their home environment. So the only reason I see to make sure that someone's online is to make sure that if they're not online, that I know that they're okay. We work remotely at the TTC, and that's one of the things when I onboard people that I tell them the only time I'm going to be checking to see if you're online is to make sure that you're okay, and that if I expected you to be working and I can't see that you're online, that something hasn't happened to you, because we have this responsibility, especially for people that perhaps are single, live by themselves, to make sure that they're actually so I think we naturally go to, are they working hard enough? But actually, are you safe and well? Is everything okay with you? I think there's this flip side to making sure, and maybe having a bit more empathy in our approach, that rather than believing ill first, actually think, let's consider if there's what's going on. And this is where I think in terms of social mobility as well, there's often quite a difference in experience and why people may not want to be on things like video calls showing their backgrounds, and it might be you might be sharing your working space with more than one individual. So I think if I could put something in the no bucket, it would be that expectation that everyone should have their camera on all day, every day. That of course neurodivergence comes into it, but I think that having this expectation that you can peer through the peephole into people's private homes, we have to step away from that, and because people have, and there's been examples in the press where there's been comments made about people's home environments and their setups, and regular noise, and maybe it's so exposing. I think that can be really challenging psychologically for people to feel that they've had to share up front so much about their world, their life, who's involved in their home, and that I think for me is, let's try to step away from that, and allow people to have some, be online, be working, but not necessarily have to be on video and showing, absolutely everything about their world. Especially, I think this comes into play massively for caregivers during school holidays, and you might have little voices around and little people wanting to kind of ask questions. Those things are really difficult, and if you feel that you feel even more judged in those situations, there's that's why I put in the no-nos. So if we've talked about some of the challenges, what does a great digital work environment look like? What should we be doing, and what should we be kind of focusing on? Like, can you give me some sort of practices for businesses to be trying?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it is vital to set out, first understand where you are, what is it that your people's kind of greatest challenges are, and then look ahead to what you want to change your culture to, what you want your culture to be. Then start to communicate that. So I think having kind of broad sets of principles are really helpful, but also enabling teams to create their own approaches. So not having rules across an organization, but rather principles, letting teams figure out between them what days best to come in the office, for instance, how they want to work. And I think also educating on some of the ways in which our behaviours can impact each other, which we might not necessarily think about. A really obvious one is sending emails outside of typical working hours. So the thing that you can do is delay delivery, so that if you're working late or working flexibly, you think before you hit send about what time the other person will be working, and then sending it at a time that's convenient for them. So I think it's that really kind of thoughtful and intentional way of working. Another key thing when it comes to inclusion is that a report from Deloitte recently showed that 60% of women working in remote settings feel that they're excluded from important decisions. And actually, when we work with organisations, what we see is pretty much always that tends to be the skew, that if you're working more remotely, you are feeling more excluded. So also, I think an inclusive culture starts to think about, well, how do we ensure that those who are working remotely are not being inadvertently excluded from conversations, from important meetings, and how do we make sure that their voices are being heard just as much, that they're given the same opportunities as well. And I think it's really just embedding it throughout your culture, setting those expectations, leaders leading the way through their behaviour, being aware of the shadow that their behaviours cast, and then embedding some of this digital ways of working into your training from early careers when they join, as well as kind of just throughout your organisation too.
What do you feel in terms of like that scheduled send? I think that's really, really helpful. I know that some people started to include in their email signatures that I work outside of normal office hours. Do you feel that that's enough, or do you think actually that's another type of pressure that people receive? Have you seen kind of voices on that?
I think that the email footers are a brilliant first step towards showing that is something that that we care about, is making sure that others can switch off. But actually, it's our actions that make the biggest difference. So you can have that on your email footer and then send somebody an email late at night and expect a response quickly the next day, and then actually your actions are out of line with what that states. I think that really the key is layering lots of small positive contributors on top of each other. So I would say that that is important. I would say that actually it's incredible when I run training that there are still quite a few people that aren't aware of delay delivery. So actually kind of just setting out some of the options that are available to people. And I think also having open conversations is a really key one. Mm-hmm. So in your next team meeting, actually, can you bring some of these kind of topics, whether it be digital well-being and burnout, and then just have a bit of an open discussion, see what comes out of it. And actually you find that the greatest knowledge lies in the room. And that's what I love within kind of the workshops that I run and working with organizations, that actually the greatest kind of suggestions for improvement will always come from the people that are working within your team. And there's a lot that you can glean from there to be able to take the first steps to improving. So I would say that's the key.
I think that opportunity to educate, so people that know, that digital wellbeing is a thing, and as you say, give people those tools, and especially when we're talking about intergenerational working, making sure that everyone has equal access to those tools and understanding things like schedule send. But even when we talk about things like Trello and those platforms, even talking about them and not explaining what these sorts of platforms do can feel like an othering tool. So I think making sure that everyone's had this equal introduction to things we're going to even explore to help them problem solve, because that, I think, as part of any sort of D&I journey, bringing people along and that people listening piece is the most important part. Otherwise you won't have the success of it actually bedding in your organization if you've not done that work to actually bring people along. I know that you mentioned career progression, and I think this is one of the areas that is a bit of a key battleground when we think about remote working, is how can you still enable fair career progression, and how this doesn't become another kind of disabling factor for underrepresented groups, that they're not seen in the room. Do you have any kind of tips that you've seen has worked particularly well to kind of equalize that?
Yeah, I think here actually, so career progression, a lot of the key holders and the kind of gateway is leaders and people managers. So I think here it's very much working with people managers around what are some of those barriers to progression and to inclusion within that digital environment, and really starting to educate on some of these new nuances. We all move to digital work incredibly quickly, and actually our managers and our leaders often just we don't have the time to educate ourselves. And if it's not kind of part of the ongoing training, that can be a challenge for people to actually know what are some of the simple things that they should be doing. So for instance, it would be looking at things like educating on proximity bias, so that we actually just know it's a thing to start with, and then how practical ways to make sure that we're managing our remote and hybrid teams to not, to care for mitigating that. Also things like how you mentioned video on within video calls. Again, that's another digital belief that can have an impact on people from a different socioeconomic background, kind of neurodivergent, and then challenging that. So actually having leaders challenge, well, why are you judging that if someone's turned their camera off, it must mean that they're disengaged and they're multitasking and checking their emails? That's not true. So I think that is absolutely the key, is working with people managers to understand what are the digital behaviours and the digital beliefs that are actually having this impact on inclusion that we might not be aware of.
And I would definitely say that we don't need to bring in the bad practice from our in-person activity into our digital space. So where we've seen some effort to try to equalise experience, things like making sure there's fair note-taking in a meeting so that people that are both in, out of that meeting have access, not delegating that to the woman necessarily in the space. We've seen that, and it's like, hey, could we not have got rid of that really negative sort of approach between the two? But we've seen that against the housekeeping of setting up those Trello boards or those mural boards for this kind of admin work that doesn't fit to anyone's role, particularly in certain teams, is starting to fall to underrepresented groups. And when we think about then their access to be able to be present in the meeting, if they're the ones that are managing the Trello or the Jam board, they're not able to participate in the same way. So make sure that there's a rotating allocation. If there isn't someone that's within your team that's their role, that it's fair when we're thinking about all of those things as well. So when we're building in the tools that we can access, make sure that we're not making that someone's side of desk project that they're not going to be celebrated for. It's not going to be something that's going to help their progression, and actually it just beds them in as someone that is doing more and not being valued for it. So I think that to me is really important when we're thinking about progression pieces, and that fair allocation of work, making sure that it's not, well, we'll get this, so and so will do that because they'll do it quickly because it's that proximity bias, but it's also that you're building your bias into those relationships and not giving people an opportunity to use the tools and use their different experiences for things. We've seen that play out in a few different ways as well.
I remember that from your Manchester roadshow that I came to around your report that's just been released. And that was one of the points that I really took away, was that non-promotable tasks. And it's what I love about that is it's one of those things that are unconscious within society. You don't notice it, but as soon as somebody says, is it generally the woman that will take the notes in a meeting, then it's like, once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. And I think that's the value of having these conversations, is that it suddenly makes you go, oh my gosh, yes, is this a thing that we're doing? And actually, is this something that we need to be talking about?
And all of these tools that we're talking about using are brilliant and will help run our meetings well and all of those sorts of things, but they take effort, they're intentional. And again, we must bring that intentionality all the way through. But also I think that when we talk about diversity of thought, the opportunity for everyone to have a turn at doing whatever, keeping up the Jamboard, or you're going to have those different approaches. And as you've said, like actually engaging with your people, the solutions are most likely to be found within that group. So again, having them engage with whatever tools you're bringing in and making sure that everyone sees that as a joint responsibility will eke out into other approaches and what they're doing in terms of thinking about digital inclusion. When people, when your manager's not watching, oh, this is a meeting, oh, but actually we normally take notes. Okay, let's put this on the Jamboard. It beds it in. The more that if we make it, oh, well, actually that's always so-and-so's job to do, I don't feel responsible for that. So it's again coming back to that, is it intentional? Are we setting the right boundaries? And then we don't need to have our managers eye over us, in the same way we've got the trust. So we're kind of building that triad of across all of these things of what's important. So I could, we could talk about this forever and ever, because it's such an interesting move, and it does feel like we were a bit of a frontier of something that could be exciting and really a game changer. But we have to draw it to a close. People do want to, do need to go and do other things. So, what would be your top 3 things that you'd recommend for companies to do to be ahead of the curve in sort of digital inclusion and wellbeing?
Yeah, so I think firstly, it would be starting by reflecting on some of these questions, the things that we've been talking about. How much do you think digital behaviours and beliefs are impacting people within your organisation and inclusion within your organisation? Do you think you've got an intentional video call practice, and do people know how to use video calls? Do you think people are feeling excluded when they're working remotely? And then kind of listen into your own feeling to the responses to those questions. And if the answer is, do you know, I'm really not quite sure, then I think the next part is gathering data. And actually, I would argue that the next part comes irrespective. Even if you feel that you're sure, then gathering that data and just corroborating, checking your barometer against the reality of other people's experiences as well. But starting with that data, you then know what your starting point is. And that data also gives you the ability internally to champion what the ROI would be on working on some of these things, getting some of those stakeholders on board that maybe hold the purse strings that can be a challenge with initiatives like this, and also helps you to prioritize. You cannot do everything. You would not want to do everything straight away. So gather that data and understand what is the most important thing that you want to work on. And then the third thing I would say is learning from communities and existing practice that's out there. And that's one thing that's so incredible about the work the Tech Talent Charter is doing. There's such a wealth of knowledge here. So connecting with other people, asking that question about how others are working. You're very welcome to reach out to me as well. I'd be more than happy to talk to you about any aspect of this. And that's it, not reinventing the wheel.
My goodness, that's exactly what we're always saying, because I think that this is the thing. Lots of teams have been working this way for many years. So let's look at that good experience and pull that across the industry so that we can do this well. One of the things I'd say on data as well, and you spoke about kind of early career groups, is collecting that data. This is the beginning of what our frontier of work looks like. Being able to, you've got your focus groups and your sample cases happening in your organization right now. Collect that data, see how that grows, see how you can put in place the policies and support those people in their early career, because that will be the game changer for your retention, but also your benchmarking of decision making around what your organization is going to look like in 5-10 years. The behavior that's happening there you will be able to draw trends and understand that. And you kind of miss this opportunity at your peril, because there are organizations that are really focusing on this, and they're going to have a competitive advantage, because this is such a big part of people's lives. People want to feel valued in this way, and they want to be able to shut off and not experience burnout. That's it's a serious issue. And when we consider the focus we need to put to sort of mental health, and I think that there'll be further regulation in the near future in this area. And I think, like anything, it's better for us to have understood that in our organisation before we're forced to make change, than to wait and be told that there's quite a lot of movement that you need to make. So I think this is a very interesting area to show support of your people, but also to make such a big impact to their lives. So Alex, thank you so much for taking us through this today. It's been really interesting, and I'm sure this is not going to be the last time that we explore this. And I'm almost curious to kind of to fast forward 3 years and see how much movement we've been able to make. But so grateful for your time and for your expertise. And of course, we'll be able to share Alex's details with you all so that you can connect if you want to sort of learn more. So thank you very much for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you again.
Fantastic. I really appreciate it. And I think actually there's one thing I'll add. We are looking at running an inclusion in digital culture report in the future. So if any of your signatories are interested in taking part in research around this, then I'll provide a link that you can also share onwards. But please do reach out. If this is a topic that's touched you and you want to take part in our future research on this, do let me know. Yeah. But thank you so much for the opportunity.
Data, you know that we're data geeks, so yes, do that. Perfect. Well, thank you very much. Thank you all.